Did everybody get the perfect? Cool. All right. Sorry for the delay, everybody. Welcome to VSPG today. We have a presentation from Dr. Sally Pehrsson. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yep.
You can go ahead and Sally. Today, the title of the talk is the MacQuoid Orogeny and its global cousin, tectonics at the dawn of the Paleoproterozoic. We also have a couple announcements. So next week, Andre and I realized that we're both on a plane at the time of the seminar, different planes, but so we're not going to be able to host. So next week we're off. The following 2 weeks after that, we're in Japan. So in order to not be presenting, or for us to not be hosting at midnight into 1 p.m. or 1 a.m., we're going to be changing the time from 8 a.m. Pacific to 2 p.m. Pacific for those 2 weeks. The next two seminars, we'll be doing it at 2 p.m. Pacific time. Andre, I think that's all for announcements, right? Yeah, I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Then I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sally for us. Sally Pehrsson is a senior research scientist with the Geological Survey of Canada and an adjunct professor at the Department of Geological Sciences in the University of Saskatchewan. She's spent 30 years mapping Canada's Precambrian shield and other younger origins. Her research focuses on Precambrian tectonics and global metallogeny, looking to the reconstruction of past paleogeographies as clues to regional mineral potential. She has recently completed a new synthesis of the shield's Archean to Mesoproterozoic history and is co-editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences. In her spare time, she's an avid skier, a fantasy author, and an utterly hopeless knitter, which are Sally's words, not mine. So, Sally, thanks for coming and being with us today. We're looking forward to hearing what you've got. So please take it away, and I'll get on making sure. Let me just make sure we have everybody muted real quick. I need to mute everybody. Okay, Sally, please unmute yourself now, and you can go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
There, how's that?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
Great. So just one small caveat. I am working from home today and there's no one else at home. So if you hear some loud barking and fussing, it's entirely possible it is our puppy. Hopefully not. So thank you so very much, Alex. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. As Alex alluded to, we have been just finishing a major new compilation of the Canadian Shield, and some of what I'm presenting today results from that. My co-authors are the ones that have been most involved in this, the material that's gone into this talk, but obviously there's a small cast of thousands of colleagues and university researchers and students that have been a part of this. And so when we upload the talk, I will make additional references available to Alex. Whoops, come on.
Are you struggling to get the slides to move? Okay, you're good. But we have an issue with you being muted again.
There, is that okay now?
Yes.
Okay, so where this all began was almost sort of 20 years ago now. There was a paper published by my colleague Rob Berman and Richard Stern of University of Alberta that were looking at monazite, uranium, thorium geochronology on the shrimp and how to do in-situ dating. And one of the first samples they chose to analyze just by happenstance was a metasedimentary paranise from west of Hudson's Bay in what's called the MacQuoid Belt. And what this showed was something kind of unusual. It was a 2.5 GA metamorphism. And so for those of us that have been working in this region for a very long time, Everything was 2.6, 2.7 or older, or it was Trans-Hudson and 1.8. So this was quite a surprise. Oh, wow, is there ever a delay in it shifting? Come on. We're going to try this again. Oh, come on. I'm not.
Let's see. So you're just sharing your other screen, right? Your like second monitor screen. Again, we're having some issues with you coming in and out of mute and unmute.
I haven't touched anything, so I don't know why it's cycling in and out.
Okay.
That's weird.
All right, I'll watch.
Is it there? Okay, now it's moved. All right, maybe there's some sort of weird delay. We can blame it on our firewalls. So the happy thing is that we've just completed a decade of new mapping in Canada's far north, and these various different colored dots are all the station locations grouped through the last decade under what was known as the GEM program, the Geoscience for Energy and Minerals program. And the pictures around show just a few of the major projects headed by my colleagues that were really looking at this region. And as a result of this, we've been able to, for the first time, compile a much bigger picture of the 2.5 orogens in the Northern Shield, which we term the MacQuoid Orogeny, and I will use that term throughout. So the challenge in doing this, quite outside the logistical and other challenges of working in the far north, is that the Churchill province, the region that is shown in the two colors of gray, just west of Hudson Bay in the upper left figure, was basically broken out of a previous supercraton around 2.1. And so what we have now are pieces that are fragmentary, and the record is removed in places. And these were reassembled at the core of the continent Laurentia and the supercontinent Nuna by about 1.85. And as a result of that dance of assembly and breakup, much of the interior hinterland is overprinted by 2.3, 1.8, and 1.9 orogens. We refer to these at 2.3 as the Arrowsmith, and the map on the upper right shows the range of its metamorphism as we now understand it across the Ray Craton. The 1.9 snowbird orogen is probably more familiar to most of you as one of the facets implicated in the famous snowbird tectonic zone and the accretion of Ray and Hearn cratons. And then the lower right figure shows the 1.8 to 1.5 extent of the Trans-Hudson orogen and its different metamorphic facies, which now go almost all the way to the slave craton and the Queen Maud block. So that looking at the metamorphism of these sequences, we're dealing with a delicate overprinting situation where you can have early Barrovian MacQuoid metamorphism shown in the garnet picture here with the calcium and manganese maps, but that these are overprinted by higher pressure, different condition rims that relate to in this example, 1.9 snowbird event. And the lower right or lower left, we're just showing an example of where Ray and Hearn lay within Laurentia as Nuna was amalgamating, including accretion of parts of Australia, etc. So a complicated story, but one that we're beginning to be able to pull together. What we now know of MacQuoid tectonometamorphism, and I will use that term to define, subscribe 2.55 to 2.50 to 49, tectonometamorphism is a zone up to 1,400 kilometers long and 100 kilometers across. It now stretches from Melville Peninsula through windows of overprinting to the Chesterfield Inlet off of Hudson Bay and down as far as Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. The important thing about it is that we have a wonderful preservation in several originally much higher crustal blocks that have been dropped down in the Paleoproterozoic origins of the conditions and preserved metamorphic field gradient, particularly in the Yathkid belt, which is shown in the central part of the diagram. There we have a complete gradient from green schist through amphibolite, lower, middle, and upper amphibolite, and even locally granulite. And some of these pictures just show you an example of what these rocks look like in the field. One of the important pins for understanding the presence and the distribution of this event is that it is cut through by a major metadiabase dike swarm that is dated at 2.19. So we're very comfortable that we are not dealing with 1.8 or 1.9 or 2 assemblages. The conditions are often found and recorded in either early core fabrics preserved in garnet, such as at Melville Peninsula, or in fact, in some places, the main regional tectonometamorphic assemblages, such as the kyanite storolite schists of the MacQuoid Belt. And they're even recorded, as the little crosses show, as cobbles or boulders in the Paleoproterozoic conglomerates. They're quite distinctive, the storolite and kyanite bearing schists. In its type area, the MacQuoid Belt, which is exposed just from the upper northeast on Chesterville Inlet down toward the northwest, it extends for 530 kilometers by 60 kilometers wide. And it's predominantly a belt of green schist to storolite kyanite garnet, or garnet slimonite Barrovian facies. It overprints greenstone belts that were formed between 2.6 and 2.7 GA. And these are metaturbidite and metavolcanic sequences that are very helpful for recording those assemblages, particularly the widespread distribution of the metapelites. There's pictures of these shown here. And then another example of the dated 2.19 MacQuoid metadiabases cutting through the MacQuoid age fabrics. As highlighted from what Rob and Richard originally did, we have inclusion of MacQuoid age monazites within the newly grown garnet assemblages that have a distinct composition from the later overprinting snowbird metamorphic assemblages. And so what we see is a clockwise PTT path recorded in a shallow southeast vergent fold thrust belt that is over much of its length Barrovian. And these are recumbent F1 folds and out of sequence thrusts that locally overturn the metamorphic isograds. And this is particularly well shown in the Yathkid belt immediately to the southwest. These cross sections on the right-hand side show you the overall architecture of the MacQuoid age belt, where we have an upper tectonostratigraphic assemblage with upright to overturned and inclined folds that are cut from the lower assemblages through a southeast vergent shear zone, and then ultimately from a larger regional footwall zone, the Tyrrell shear zone, a major southeast vergent thrust. We also very definitely can record hornblende and isograds and others that show in the greenstone belt that show we have inverted metamorphic gradients in large recumbent F2 folds overprinting earlier 2.5 F1 or D1. And as you can see from this Aeromag signature, there's no doubt that all of this is transected by the 2.19 Ptolemy dike swarm. You can see the dikes cutting through the northeast trending 2.54 regional fabrics, and also the Mackenzie diabases are shown in that diagram. So probably the most famous part about MacQuoid age metamorphism in Churchill, the one that most people will know about, is the high pressure granulite and eclogite myelinites. These are probably have been written about most from the what we call the Tentado domain in southwest aerial extent. They're just north of Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan. And these are the beautiful eclogites that the University of Massachusetts group have been working on. And they're range from moderately strained rocks into really spectacularly highly strained orthopyroxene garnet bearing myelinites that record conditions of up to eclogite facies. They're also found immediately to the northeast in the Chipman area, and then the Yathkid belt and the MacQuoid belt are shown with their lower grade conditions intervening. And then ultimately at the northeast end, again, closer to Hudson Bay, we have the reappearance of the high pressure granulites, where we have the Hanbury Uvuok and complexes and the Big Lake shear zone. The region along Chesterville Inlet has absolutely spectacularly well preserved strain gradients in these rocks. Delicate symplectite textures, a lot of Gerberic, anorthosite, and mafic intrusions that are Neo-Archean in age that then are overprinted by the 2.54 myelinization. These are just beautiful to work on. The Big Lake shear zone is the one that's been published on most recently by my colleague Daniele Regis, and it is found on the northern side of the MacQuoid greenstone belt. And there we have 2.54 assemblages that are actually found within the dated titanites in the assemblage. These are garnet clinopyroxenites from metamorphic and meta-anorthositic rocks. And they are also, as shown in this picture, demonstrably cross-cut by the 2.19 MacQuoid dikes. Daniele has shown that these are high-pressure granulites from pseudosection modeling and assemblages. And so we're really comfortable that this really definitely is high-pressure granulite conditions at 2.54. He also showed from titanite diffusion modeling that these rocks were exhumed to the surface very quickly thereafter by about 2.5. So a very rapid counterclockwise PTT curve. The other thing that's new about the what we've discovered in the last decade is the extent of MacQuoid age magmatism and sedimentation in the ray, the craton in particular. There's an awful lot of real estate that did not prior to this have uranium-led crystallization ages or metamorphic ages, and we're finding that in region after region, rocks that were thought to be 2.7 to 2.6 are actually latest Neo-Archean or even Paleoproterozoic. From the northeast to the southwest, from Boothia Peninsula, we have a lower Boothia assemblage metasediments. These are predominantly shallow marine carbonates, siltstones, sandstones. Down by the time we get to McCann Basin, these are predominantly metasedimentary that produce spectacular garnet diatexites. They have interbedded iron formation. And Amarulic Basin, it's slightly lower metamorphic grade. There you're able to see that they are definitely large-scale turbiditic sequences. But they are quite distinctive from some of the other meta-Archean metasedimentary rocks in the region because they are much more fertile. They're a first cycle. They haven't seen the preceding 2.6 to 2.7 metamorphism. And so they produce very large coalesced S-type melt pockets that is well mappable. In addition, we have 2.55 to 2.5 plutonic suites from Boothia through the Queen Maud granites to the Nunavut basement area and some of the Tultson basement, and also down closer to the Snowbird tectonic zone. And these are predominantly granodioritic rocks that have got a variety of different geochemistries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see the great lateral extent of them through an area that was all thought to be earlier Neo-Archean to Mesoarchean. We also have in the Perry Bay area preservation of 2.5 rhenium osmium ages in mantle xenoliths and kimberlites. The 2.5 rocks have probably been looked at in most detail for their geochemistry in the Nunavut basement complex, and this is where Ben Neal is doing his PhD thesis with Tom Chaco. There they have a suite of calc-alkaline granitoids and mafic rocks that are biotite hornblende diorites, 2 quartz diorites and granodiorites that have a really well-constrained age of about 2.5. And he's working on looking at the context for these. And the suggestion is that this is a period of extension and melting coming up late at the end of the orogeny up into the foreland area where there are metasedimentary packages. And this is also seen in the Boothia terrain where Daniele Regis and Mary Sanborn Berry have developed a model that shows that about 2550 to 2510, we have shortening, magmatism, thickening in the crustal welt there. Then shortly thereafterwards, we have perhaps subduction retreat to produce the sedimentary basins that are shown, and then intrusion of intermediate to mafic magmas. So the point I'd like you to take away from this is that the new regional extent shows that this event is no longer confined to the Snowbird tectonic zone, which is what you will see over and over and over again in the literature. This Barrovian through high pressure granulite and eclogite conditions are, broadly speaking, consistent with an accretionary orogeny. We do have preserved in the higher crustal levels, such as MacQuoid and Yathkid, a very well-defined east-vergent thrust stack. So it's tempting to suggest that there's a primary orogenic architecture here with a locus of foreland sedimentation or foredeep sedimentation west of the preserved full thrust belt. The unfortunate thing that makes this difficult is that whatever could have collided on the east or west is now removed by post 2.1 rifting. And so we don't have as well as we would like, constrained architecture yet, but we are definitely working on it. But the other thing I want to do today is I want to look at, because this time period is so interesting, what I call MacQuoid's global cousins. So at the time when it was first recognized, it was not well known from very, very many cratonic blocks around the world, but that has changed substantially in the last 20 years. 2.55 to 2.50 orogenesis is now found on nearly 24 cratons and microcontinental fragments globally. These are the ones shown in red here. I call them the Nunavut plan after a supercraton model that was published in 2013. The ones that are perhaps you know well as Superia are shown in blue, or the older Valbara shown in green. And the little suns are locations of the early Paleoproterozoic glacial sequences globally. And you can immediately see that they are all known only from Superia or Valbara cratons. The better known portions of this record are presently found in North China, Darwar, the Gawler Craton of South Australia, parts of San Francisco and Amazonia, and Ray. But there are also fragmentary records in the Sass Craton, the Grouse Creek Block and Selway terrain of the Southwest US collage, parts of Congo and West Africa, and Siberia. The North China Craton is particularly interesting because it seems to have a range of orogenic levels exposed. These cross sections are from Tim Kuski and his group, and Liu and Yang et al., Ning et al., and Zhang et al. Come out quite recently. And they are suggesting that the eastern block of the North China Craton accreted to what is known as the Wutai Fuping arc by about 2.47 GA. They suggest that we've got a nap-like southeast vergent architecture that can be shown, and that there is a shallow marine and possible accretionary melange preserved in this sequence, along with garnet columnar peroxenites within the accretionary melange around the Zhenhe, I'm probably saying it wrong, region. These latter garnet peroxenites have recently been shown to have 2.53 to 2.47 metamorphism at 19 to 24 kilobars and cut by granites at 2.47 GA. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that there is as big a raging debate about whether or not this suture is 2.5-ish, MacQuoid-ish, or 1.85, as there has been historically in the Snowbird tectonic zone in the Canadian Shield. But it does seem to be clear that some of these garnet peroxenites are cut by granites at that age. And there are also early M1 conditions of Barrovian pressure and temperature at 2507 that have been directly identified prior to the 1890 high pressure overprint. So it is very much like the Canadian Shield, a mixed story. The other craton that has a really lovely record is the Darwar craton of India and Madagascar. There's recently published garnet felsic granulite conditions that show also high pressure granulite counterclockwise PTT paths. There are garnet kyanite felsic granulites of up to 16 kilobars from Anderson et al.'s group. And most of the models suggest that this is a result of micro block accretion and assembly of Darwar from several different smaller sections. Similar to Wutai, and importantly for the models of this time, it includes 2.7 to 2.5 greenstone belts and basins, which helps substantially with understanding this overall evolution. The other that I refer to is Valbara, of course, and there are suggestions that there may have been subduction underneath it at about 2.5, but this is a very fragmentary record for right now, so I'm not going to touch on it, just to let you know it's out there. So what are the common features of MacQuoid orogens globally? Well, a number of them do seem to have juvenile crustal addition and formation of greenstone belts and microblocks immediately preceding their regional tectonometamorphism. Most of them have a preceding history also of 2.7 or even older, but also 2.58 magmatism. These strongly vergent orogenic melts contrast with some of the Neo-Archean to Mesoarchean geometry, and they are dominated by highly inclined to recumbent folding at all crustal levels, not just mid-crustal levels. The clockwise PT paths have abundant preservation of UHP granulite and eclogite, and even crustal eclogite xenoliths of up to 25 kilobar have been preserved in younger kimberlites. Daniele has shown that we have rapid exhumation at this time of rates similar to what preserves high pressure assemblages in parts of the Alps. Possibly there are ophiolites and melanges in North China craton. That work is continuing. And this, I would say together that the origin, scale, facies, and evolution, as others have also said, is typical of alpine style orogeny. And our recent compilation of the conditions of metamorphism during MacQuoid time that we're showing here has 18 different examples of high pressure granulite on 5 different continents, so that it forms the largest and most widespread early preserved high pressure metamorphic terrains. I have originally looked at the late Neo-Archean, Silurian, and Triassian time period for these cratons, and what fell out of it was what I call the triple barcode. Most of the cratons that have MacQuoid orogenesis also have succeeding Arrowsmith orogeny at a younger time period up to 2.3 GA, and most of them also have crust formation down to 2.6, unlike superior cratons that seem to have stopped that major crust formation somewhat earlier. And in contrast to the superior cratons, at the same time that we have MacQuoid and Arrowsmith orogenesis on superior cratons, such as the Hurn shown here, we have quiescence and deposition of the famous glacial diamictites. So there we have an enigma. The MacQuoid event is occurring on a large number of cratons and cratonic pieces worldwide during an otherwise global quiet time, but one of major environmental change. As shown in the Huronian-Makganyene image here from my colleague Rob Rainbird, you have 3 cycles of global glaciation just after the time period of MacQuoid orogenesis, and this is typical of the superior cratons, as I note. It's often suggested that this is triggered by and related to breakup of the supercontinent Knorrland, an amalgamation I'll talk about in a minute, and the first multi-continent passive margins, and also suggested biological diversification after this time. So tectonic feedbacks between life and evolution. But the most important thing is that it is the lead up to the Paleoproterozoic icehouse glaciations. And so I show here several different figures that highlight at the time period when we have the major glaciations almost as old as 2.45, just following on from our MacQuoid time period. And this overlaps with the change from a dominantly reducing conditions in the Earth's atmosphere and hydrosphere to oxidizing conditions and ultimately the GOE. So when we want to consider, is there secular change at MacQuoid time? Well, yes, most people think there is, although many different compilations show many different facets. In this one from Palin et al. In 2020, the suggestion is that through the 2.7 to 2.5 time period, when we have Knorrland forming, we have a transition from what people might call stagnant lid tectonics prior to 3.0 to more mobile lid, quasi-modern like, but possibly more warm and shallow tectonics. And this is absolutely hotly debated by everyone, as we all know, and many people suggest the other end member of this is that we had accretionary tectonics with shallow subduction starting possibly as early as 3.2, and that the transition through to MacQuoid time and Knorrland sees the onset of more Wilson cycle-like tectonics. Now, we're not here to debate that right now. What we want to think about is what is happening at MacQuoid time now that we are seeing a much greater global record and a much richer global record of orogenesis at this period. This diagram from Chris Hawksworth and his colleagues shows nicely the change at about 2.5 that's most dramatic is that we see a much greater thickness of preserved juvenile continental crust. And this is linked to the idea that we have an emergence of land above the submarine conditions at this time. Also, there are preservations of some important ore deposit types. And in this case, let me highlight, I am just referring to cratons with MacQuoid orogenesis, not those like Superior that has nickel copper PGE in its large igneous provinces. These are deposits in mafic magmatic systems that are thought to be Alaska type deposits or more PGE rich systems associated with contraction. There are Beshi-type volcanic-hosted massive sulfide deposits in the Wutai Greenstone Belt and its extensions and similar sequences in China and Korea. And there are early porphyry copper deposits in Melanjkhand of India, as shown in Holly Stein's work. And these highlight that multiple different deposit types that in the latter time period are all thought to be strictly restricted to being preserved or formed in contractional origins are being found at 2.5. There are debates that there could be porphyry copper deposits prior to 2.5, but many people that focus on working on porphyry copper systems suggest this is not possible, and that they don't appear until we have sufficient flux from the subducting slab to oxidize and alter the overlying mantle wedge. Are there ophiolites of this time? Well, possibly, if you accept a lot of the work that's being shown for North China craton. It's looking very intriguing. One of the things I want to highlight for people is a recent compilation by Furness and Dillick on ophiolites and what is a wonderful term, I believe it was coined by Shalal Senghor, ophiorags, dismembered ophiolites. And they suggest that the transition through 2.5 is a preservation transition from what are purely supersubduction zone ophiolites, aka Archean greenstone belts, and we'll leave that debate for another day, through to after 2.5 more mid-ocean ridge-like and supersubduction zone ophiolites, and that this is happening at the 2.5 transition. So then into this, the question would be, what does North China's sequence look like? An ophiorag or other pieces? How does it compare between recognized Archean abducted submarine sequences and Proterozoic abducted greenstone sequences? And of course, they're highlighting the arrival of more Wilson cycle-like tectonics at this point. But the most intriguing and really, really well-defined transition at 2.5 is in melt chemistry. And this is a compilation on the left from Mike Lesher, who has worked on nickel hosting mafic, ultramafic sequences all over the world and throughout time. And they show absolutely definitively that at 2.5 GA, there is an incredibly abrupt decrease in the magnesium content of erupted komatiites and primitive basalts. And that this correlates with a temperature, a decreased temperature of formation of these melts in time. My colleague Chris Lully and other researchers have suggested that at this time there is also a change in trace element chemistry in these intrusions, and also changes in the actual lavas themselves, so that there is a abrupt change in the mid and heavy rare earth ratios in basalts and rhyolites at 2.5, and a jump in incompatible elements in basalts and andesites. What does this mean for MacQuoid time? Well, clearly something is changing in the mantle. Also, this directly influences the metamorphic assemblages and exhumation potential of these sequences prior to after. And this has been nicely summarized by Richard Palin in a recent paper. Okay. Also, life. The early 2.5 to 1.6 microfossil assemblages include a host of different early creatures, and including eukaryotes, prokaryotes. And the suggestion is that the oxygen chemistry at this time, which was not fully oxygenated, it's the earliest 2.5 period, restrained a radiation of life until a later period. It's thought that the emergence of continents helped to prolong this, but I think one of the most intriguing things, think back to the chemistry change I've just shown, a huge change in magnesium number in those erupted lavas and komatiites suggests that you are going from a more nickel-rich system to a more copper-rich system. And so life, being life, uses what its niche has. And beautifully in parallel to this, it's been shown that after 2.5 GA, sometime in this period, there is a change in use by the early biota of nickel as ions in its enzymes to copper as ions and enzymes. And this parallels the komatiite record. We use what we have locally. So sulfur mass independent fractionation, SMIF, WIFs, GOE, and the carbon isotopic curve. There are many, many people here online that are much more knowledgeable to speak to this, but I just want to highlight to everybody that if we want to understand the triggers for early oxygenation of Earth's atmosphere by circa 2.4, we need to understand the tectonics that preceded it. We know that the isotopic record from both carbon, manganese, cerium, iron, and a host of others suggests that there was an increase in uranium redox cycling and transport by 2.47, that there were transient developments of redox declines, the WIFs, particularly in certain perhaps restricted places in a stratified ocean, high chrome abundances associated with oxidative weathering, and pyritic sedimentary intervals that show transient mass-dependent fractionation and rise in seawater sulfate. The carbon isotope for diagram here is, of course, from Andre and others that shows right around 2.5, just shortly after we start to see that abrupt change that leads on through to the famous Loma-Gundy excursion. So why are we concerned about 2.5? Well, many people, and you will see this shown over and over again, that Kenorland as a supercontinent and its lip breakout influenced the GOE and the ice houses. There's suggestions that you can show dynamic links between changes in the state of ocean and atmosphere during different phases of a supercontinent breakup that will trigger these icehouse events. This breakup changes runoff. It requires low carbon dioxide concentrations to yield it, but alternatively, others have suggested, like Campbell and others, that the increased subduction can bury the oxygen sinks. And so we do know that in the superior cratons, there are lips at about 2.55, but these are not global. We have almost as much real estate at this time that is part of Nunavut. So what was happening globally just prior to this time? Well, Kenorland is an idea that's been around for a long time, a single unified late Neo-Archean, earliest Paleoproterozoic supercontinent. There's two different pieces shown here, two different reconstructions shown here from Lowry Pehrsson and also Aspler and Chirangelli's famous one. And the construct in this was that Wyoming, Hearn, Superior, et cetera, in the North American present configuration were all together since that time. Now, from stratigraphic and other reasons, my colleague Wouter Bleeker and many others have shown that this does not fit, and Wouter importantly showed that there were craton clans globally at this time. So he calls the ones that have the typical glacial associations and Huronian supergroup superior after the type sequence and superior craton. And they're making good strides at reconstructing the pieces that are involved with it. The important thing that we need to remember now is that it lay at equatorial paleolatitudes at this time. It includes all of these important glacial icehouse successions, and it was assembled by 2.7 to 2.6 and broke up quite a bit later. The triple barcode that I spoke about earlier is the foundation for the second Neo-Archean supercraton that I've published, which is Nunavut. And this is an example of some of the possible reconstructions that are part of it, from Jason French and Larry Heeman for a slave and Darwar reconstruction on the bottom, and also an Antarctica, India reconstruction for Salmon and et al. Shown in other references shown in that overview quite recently. It assembled by 2.5 to 2.4 and broke up by about 207 to 2 billion GA. So it did not break up at 2.4 or 2.5. It's difficult to make a lot more headway at this point in the reconstruction of it in terms of direct linking and matching paleomagnetically, because many of the pieces, as I've just discussed, are overprinted by orogenesis that's too high a grade subsequently to return primary paleopoles. But the paleogeographic tests that we are able to do for Nunavut and Superior, and here again, I'm showing the recent publication of Johanna Salmon et al. That just came out. It allows a Nunavut and Superior reconstructions as independent entities, the one at high paleolatitudes, the other at low paleolatitudes, but not a single Kenorland. The ones that are at equatorial paleolatitudes are those that have the glaciations, but the ones that are at high paleolatitudes show no glacial record that we know of. So the implications of this, well, I'm going to highlight that obviously there does not appear to be evidence for a single stable Kenorland that would be driving through lips and break up the GOE by 2.4 GA. Those that we do have a record of, we know that they assembled and did not fully break up until after 2.1, after the GOE. So that is not what is driving the situation. But one of the facets that is most intriguing, and I want to leave you with this to think about, we do really need to understand MacQuoid orogenies better, not just for the paleogeography, but how they may have influenced or reflect secular change in Earth's evolving geodynamics and biosphere hydrosphere. And I highlight for you a really thought-provoking talk given by Graham Begg, who has been researching the nature of the lithospheric mantle for many years. We know that by 2.5, there are changes in the preservation and destruction rate of latest Neo-Archean, earliest Paleoproterozoic crust. Graham and his group with the GLAM project have been mapping the lithosphere globally. And this example for North America shows that what is recognized through tomography and a host of other combined geologic characteristics shows that the lithospheric route, the old cold Archean lithospheric route, continues well beyond the distribution of the actual superficial crust. And he has argued that the Earth's Archean surface may have lost up to 60% of its crust, that which was associated with the great production of major greenstone belts between 2.7 and 2.6. And I'll leave you with the question, if Graham's right, and it's an if, can this explain the cooling of komatiites, the MacQuoid orogenesis changes to greater preservation and exhumation of high pressure granulites due to fundamental related changes in the lithosphere? Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sally. It's really good. Well done. We're going to transition to a question and discussion section. Before we get there, I'm currently struggling with my real computer Zoom, so I'm on my iPad. So I think I've explored this enough to be able to run this just fine, but apologies for any hiccups ahead of time. So for questions, you can either type your question into the chat and I can ask it for you, or you can find the raise hand button in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Yes, so let's go ahead.
So maybe I can ask or get started. Could you explain a little bit more, Sally, what the 60% loss of upper continental crust is based on? And I'm interested in it because on Nunavut cratons, you don't have a record of this time. And so we could have experienced glaciation, but it just no sedimentary record is preserved there.
Well, based on the, first off, the latter point, Andre, the time frame of deformation and metamorphism as we know it extends from 2.55 to just, yeah, Rob Rainbird's just highlighting that picture is you, Andre, that I caught asleep in the back of the helicopter. So the time frame for Nunavut deformation and metamorphism and MacQuoid orogenies is 2.55 to about 2.44, which means it just overlaps with the earliest record of sedimentation. Then we seem to have a little bit of a gap, possibly between, in many of them, to about 2.40, and then there's a continuous orogenic and sedimentation history in an active orogenic setting down to about 2.3. So it's not that there wasn't sedimentation at that time, it's sedimentation in a different tectonic setting, it's sedimentation overlapping with global orogenesis. So that, I think, is the really intriguing question, is what would that look like if we had glaciations at that time? It's not that the orogenic record has removed something necessarily, it's more that perhaps the setting wasn't conducive. We don't have or at least as we know right now, we don't have much of a non-marine record preserved through that period. So this will be very interesting. I think that's really neat. In terms of the 2.6, so what Graham and the group at MacQuoid and others, Bill Griffin and Susan Riley and others, what they've done is they've compiled through tomographic imagery, ages of mantle xenoliths, MT, magnetotelluric, deep sequences, fault histories, et cetera, map of where the cool lithospheric roots to the different cratons sit. They've done this the world over as part of, and it was initiated by BHP Billiton, I believe, many years ago in order to try to look at the potential for diamonds. And so the intriguing thing is that if you remember a figure that Dave Corrigan and I once showed that had, like my first shot, a zodiac rubber boat with a bunch of people on top. The Paleoproterozoic accreted terrains and Archean cratonic blocks are the people sitting on the boat. And so the mismatch between what is present in crustal belts at the surface, like the Yavapai or Mazatzal orogens that are Paleoproterozoic accretionary sequences, the mismatch between them and the distribution of the cold refractory lithosphere is what he is using to develop a model of potentially assuming that the crust originally extended to the margins of that lithospheric root in the typical keel geometry. That's where he gets the 60% difference by comparing the areal distribution of Archean cratons to that modeled root system and where the Paleoproterozoic and younger additions are. Now, I have to emphasize, there is debate amongst the lithosphere and diamond community about this. There certainly is a lot of evidence emerging that the roots are not necessarily exactly intact as they were at 2.6 to 2.7, 2.8, et cetera. If you looked at the Kopval root, it looks like a rotten tonsil that has been completely punctured through by different refertilization events. But in other cratons, it appears that there is actually a stratification in the lithosphere, or there is an architecture to the cratonic lithosphere where you can have refertilization of an Archean refractory lithosphere through younger subduction events, on a more limited scope, probably lip intrusion events, but also even in places, and if I'm remembering this correctly, it's in the southern Caribbean below Venezuela with the diamonds there. Dan Schultze and others have actually shown that you can insert sections of younger Phanerozoic lithosphere into the Archean wedge. So it's not necessarily everywhere a complete panel that is completely intact all the way down to the 670, wherever.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have a question from Stefan de Souza.
Yes, thank you, Sally, for your presentation. I have a question for you. You mentioned that there's quite a large magmatic imprint of the MacQuoid age, magmatism. I was wondering what, if you have more information on the northern extent of MacQuoid age metamorphism and structural imprint, and how did you place the limits or boundaries on the metamorphic zones?
Yeah, so in trying to do an overview like this, I'm not showing you the literally hundreds and hundreds of metamorphic monazite, zircon, titanite, rutile ages, as well as lutetium hafnium garnet ages that are being developed as well. So this is throughout all the regions that I'm showing on the map. So when you combine that with, we have greenstone sequences that are as young as 2.6 being overprinted by this tectonometamorphism in assemblages that have metamorphic zircon, monazite, titanite, rutile, et cetera, that are all showing that age, and then they're being cut by 2,2 metadiabases that's a coherent story. The distribution of them to the north, there are hints that it may be on northern Baffin Island as well as western Greenland. Part of the story comes from the sheer volume of 2.5 detritus, particularly for northwest Greenland, where Alan Nutman worked on the Inglefeld origin there. The Paleoproterozoic sediments are absolutely sick with detritus of this age, and there's no dating in the basement that I'm aware of, partly because it's really inaccessible. So we suspect from the Paleoproterozoic detrital record that there must be present. I didn't show, in order to make the diagram look a little bit better, but Boothia Peninsula with its record goes much farther north. And in fact, in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, Gordo Zinski's students and others are working on Devon Island, which is sort of halfway up the archipelago, and they are finding similar relationships. So if you think about the Nuna paleogeography, that would have originally extended with Siberia accreted to the north, but the margin between Ray and Siberia is now unfortunately cut out by the Phanerozoic Sverdrup Basin margin in the high Arctic islands. So just how much farther Ray continued north of that, we don't really know. You can do it loosely based on what you think of as the Siberia fit in Nuna at that time. But certainly, we're really comfortable saying it goes to Devon. We're really comfortable saying North Baffin, very probably Western Greenland. In terms of the intervening area and how much of that undated real estate is not Neo-Archean and 2.7 or older, as has been assumed, we don't know. What I'm showing you is reasonable inferences, conservative inferences based on the wealth of new data. In those white areas in between, some of them are covered by intercontinental basins, which, sorry, I forgot to tell you that we've taken off for the sake of showing it. We can follow them magnetically in some instances below the basins. But however, there is just thousands of square kilometers of units in the outside what I've shown you that are all just assumed to be 2.7. And everywhere that we've worked in the last several years, we're finding that assumption's been wrong.
All right, thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
Okay, next we've got one from Paul and then from Catherine Bethune in the chat. So Paul, go ahead, please.
Yeah, good work, Sally. I used to refer to the Ray Craton as the area of the Canadian Shield with one zircon age per 10,000 square kilometers.
Yeah, we've improved it a little bit, Paul, but oh my gosh,
Right.
still nowhere near what we need.
So a minor point of information and a thought. There are Siderian glacial deposits in central India. I believe in the Pastar Craton, and I refer you to a number of papers by Mohanty. And if you email me, I can send you the PDFs.
Thanks so much, Paul.
And my thought is that I'm a little skeptical about the abrupt cooling of the mantle at 2.5, particularly as a result of subduction of Archean crust. I mean, 60% of the crust is still a very small volume, I believe, relative to the mantle. So I have a difficult time imagining how mean mantle temperature can abruptly drop. Just physically, I don't understand how that's possible.
We're not talking about a large enough volume from that standpoint, assuming the thickness of the crust relative to the mantle. Yeah, well, yes, although Graham would argue that that's an absolute minimum, which is why I find it fascinating. But at the end of the day, Mike Lesher's komatiite record is absolutely, as you can see, the data is very dense. So then the next question is, what is triggering such a substantive drop? It's not progressive.
Well, the question is how representative of the entire mantle is the sample, because
well,
you know, from a small sample, I think it's dangerous to infer physically impossible situations or processes. So I think
Then
you
we
have
have
to
to
think
look at-
about the physics of just the basic thermodynamics of an abrupt whole mantle cooling event.
Actually,
Yeah,
there is a paper by Kurt Konhauser with Nick Arndt on it, and way more showing progressive decrease in magnesium content in hematites, starting from 2.7.
Yeah, that's been superseded by Mike's latest paper in 2019.
Okay.
There's a couple things in the chat that I think are relevant to this one. Bruce said, is it a change in mantle temperature or broader change in melting conditions?
Yeah, which is well taken. And the reason I want to highlight this to everybody is there is a change that we don't understand at this point. And that is the fascination of it overlapping with an unusual orogenic event that is now showing up on many, many, many more cratons. I don't ascribe to having the answers, but I think it's something we need to work on.
Yeah, Richard Ernst also pointed out here that there's a paper by Campbell a few years ago that suggests that this change in chemistry is due to formation of the D layer at the bottom of the mantle.
Mm-hmm. And earlier on, Ian Campbell had suggested that it was subduction associated with what we would now call the MacQuoid orogens that helped bury sinks that gave rise to some of the early rises in the GOE. Now, I know there are feedback mechanisms and other facets that the geochemists working on atmosphere and hydrosphere have used to suggest that that may not be sufficient to do it, but any one of these processes is an interplay of different factors. I think we need to start thinking about that.
Okay. All right, next question is in the chat from Catherine Bethune. I'm confused about high pressure rocks along the STZ. Are you now thinking that these are MacQuoid and were downdropped from higher levels at 1.9 GA? What is the relative contribution from MacQuoid and Snowbird?
It depends on what segment of the Snowbird tectonic zone you're looking at. It's absolutely clear in part of the Chipman block and part of the Tentado domain that there are high pressure granulite fabrics that are cross-cut by the younger metadiabases, and therefore consistent with UMass's monazite work are MacQuoid age. This is in parallel to what we see at the Big Lake Shear Zone much farther northeast. Those same terrains, as happens in other high pressure domains globally where you get multiple orogenic events, there are, in addition in these areas, younger sequences and younger intrusions that are recording the 1.9 Snowbird, even higher pressure events. So what we're finding is that the eclogites, particularly in Tentado, that return the highest paleo pressures, are dominantly from lutetium hafnium garnet dating 1.9. As you go northeast along the STZ, the region diverges. And so the Snowbird tectonic zone and the boundary between Ray, Chesterfield Block, and Hearn tracks substantially south of the MacQuoid belt. And nevertheless, there are mafic sequences in that upper plate setting at 1.9 that do record Snowbird high pressure, but that is distinct and is recognizable, like the Big Lake Shear Zone, as being separate from the MacQuoid event because it's being transected by the dated 1.9 diabases. And also the in situ isotopic and lutetium hafnium record is showing that. So they are somewhat subparallel as actually effectively an accident of trans-Hudson back thrusting along the southern segment, and then they diverge from each other along the northern segment. The Yathkit and MacQuoid blocks, which preserve, and particularly Yathkit, a higher crustal level, is dropped down during post 1.9 exhumation.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so David Evans had a comment about the paleomagnetism record and the possibility of Kenorland versus separate supercratons. The high latitude data from Darwar and Yilgarn are 2.4 GA, whereas low latitude results from Superia are 2.5 to 2.45 GA. So yes, there's a contrast, but also a time difference. Kenorland could have existed with a polar excursion from 2.45 to 2.4 GA.
Which would have had to be very fast, although maybe not very fast relative to modern rates. But at the moment, combining that with the extremely divergent rock record, tectonometamorphic crust formation, sedimentary records between the two sequences, it's difficult to join them into a single Kenorland superior configuration.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. So yeah, just continuing my comment, the contrast in paleolatitude, because these blocks take up space, you can come up with a reconstruction, as I have a tentative one with Bruce and other colleagues that including Richard Ernst and Kevin Chamberlain, Rajesh Srivastava, Caitlin DeMarais. So you can put the Zimbabwe Darwar cratons at the edge of Superior, at the outer edge, and you can have the 2.5 GA be kind of more external kind of tectonics around a core of Superior. And that might explain the contrast in geology and the tectonic signatures, as well as then the rapidity of the motion need not be so fast, because if they're already at moderate latitudes while the core of Superior is at the equator, then the polar excursion that they're seeing is really only something like a 45-degree excursion. So that's work in progress, and hopefully it will see the light of day very soon. But that's just a food for thought, is that what we really need if we want to test the paleomag discrepancy is rocks with good poles at the same age from the different blocks, which we unfortunately don't have yet. But yeah,
sadly, because unfortunately many of these cratonic pieces are so badly overprinted, it's going to be a challenge to get. But yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Do you know when that's going to be coming out?
Should have come out last year.
Pandemic time.
Thanks, Sally. Great presentation.
Sally, just a comment on this orogenic event and how it relates to cratons. So we, as you mentioned, based on sedimentary record with Brian Krappis, we recognized a Turi Creek orogeny in Western Australia, and kind of link it to similar response in Capwell craton. And recently, Berger Rasmussen dated fabrics and using monazite sort of got age around 2.43 for this orogenic event. The same in Wyoming, like on a southern margin, you have extension, and as you correctly pointed, it's not breakup, it's just drifting. But on the western, in modern coordinates, you have a tectonothermal event that many people related to metamorphism. So in a way, as David said, you have part of the superior, whatever, Kenorland continent that trying to break, but on periphery, it's experience sort of this orogenic events.
Yeah, and I think the best possible evidence for that, which I didn't want to get into because it's other people's work, but I'll just mention and then highlight that we all need to watch what they're doing. The data north and west of Wyoming, from a variety of colleagues, Paul Muller and others, that is definitely showing that there are older blocks in there that have been substantially intruded and or metamorphosed and deformed in that earlier time period. but most of their current models suggest that, like the buried accretionary system of Nuna below the Canadian foreland basin, the Western Canada sedimentary basin, there you have a whole series of small microblocks that were accreted and assembled during Nuna. And so that group's models presently, or as prior to the pandemic, let me put it that way, involved assembly of those pieces as a part of Nuna assembly. So I don't think in those situations you can demonstrate that they were actually attached to Wyoming, as far as I'm aware. There might be other lines of evidence out there, but the ones that really do show it, and I think these are really intriguing, and we were sort of hoping to get to Labrador in the next few years to look on this. It's Nain. The North Atlantic craton has on its northern margin near the Nunavut origin something called the Majorcac belt. This was worked on by Brendan Dyke and others. They found 2.5 magmatism and 2.5 tectonometamorphism, overprinting the older Mesoarchean sequence there. And fairly recently, there's been a work with Chris Kirkland's group and others following up a few disparate samples on the Labrador coast of Nain in the more northerly Saglek block. And unfortunately, it really is just 2 or 3 samples, hundreds of kilometers apart. Those are also showing 2.5 to 2.55 titanite and other metamorphic mineral overprints. There, they don't have the same nice detail that Brendan has in the Majorcac belt, where they can actually demonstrate that the monazites that they were dating are part of a tectonometamorphic fabric. And in addition, there's a group in Australia, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the lead author with that's coming out, where they have actually done lutetium hafnium garnet dating on those same samples. And so those garnets are very definitely 2.5, 2.55. They are not Mesoarchean. So there do seem to be funny puzzle pieces elsewhere. And some of them seem to be the other pieces that might be a link between the superior parts and the rest. We'll see.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see anything else in the chat or any hands raised. So if anybody has last thoughts, questions, feel free to speak up.
Sorry, Sally, I ask one more thing, maybe to clarify. So you mentioned that some of this 2.5 basins, they have biotherms and iron formations. So you kind of went fast over it. Could you tell which one has iron formations and which one has biotherms, and what metamorphic grade they are? Because there are obviously in iron formations at 2.5, 2.45. So.
Yeah. So the one with the well-documented iron formations in it is the McCann Basin in Southwest Ray of southeastern Northwest Territories. The other one, particularly with good carbonate sequences, and also the Marjorie sequence in the 30-mile area. But the one with the biggest well-mapped and defined carbonate sequences is the Boothia Peninsula package, the lower tectonostratigraphic assemblage there. Sadly, the McCann is Arrowsmith 2.3 granulite facies. So I'm not sure it'll be very amenable to chemostratigraphy. And also the Boothia sequences are heavily affected by the Taltson thelon origin and are slimonite grade. So that's not particularly helpful. That said, given, as I alluded to earlier, that everywhere that we touched that had not been previously dated turned out to be not the age that everyone was assuming, We're hoping to get into some of the areas that have green schist facies packages, although a number of them are kind of in a wildlife refuge at the moment. But there should be, over the next few years, more data coming out and start to understand this a bit better.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a bunch, Sally.
I
got some stuff in the chat just to say thank you. Does someone else want to speak up?
Yeah, can I just jump in here?
Oh yeah, sorry, Paul, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, Sally, about Boothia. So I had the crazy idea that Boothia is not a horst, but a thrust. And it's a thrust, I believe, of Caledonian age. So it's a far field effect of the Laurentia Baltica collision. And I infer that from the adjacent Devonian strata, which are deformed and show evidence of exhumation at that time. Is there any evidence in the basement for Caledonian age or any age activity, post-Precambrian?
Not that I've heard, but if Danny and Mary are on, they can speak to something maybe that hasn't come out yet. I'm not looking at who is still in the chat here. I
believe it extends down into Hudson Bay. I think you can see it in the Hudson Bay seismic.
Yeah. Well, and what we are finding, so I'm not aware of any new data from Boothia basement bearing on that, Paul, but what we do have is at a place called Meliadine, which is just on the north side of Rankin Inlet. There's a major Nuna thrust structure that hosts the now producing Meliadine gold mine. And we've been doing a ton of work there to look at the timing of gold mineralization, which is predominantly about 1.85, but may also have evidence for pre-conditioning at 1.9 and 2.5. But incredibly beautifully, because we dated every single mafic dike that we possibly could that cross-cut the ore, we discovered that there are weakly deformed mafic dikes of Triassic and Jurassic age coming up that fault system. So absolutely, these Nuna age and other structures are responding to, in the basement, are responding to the younger Phanerozoic and Proterozoic to Neoproterozoic structures. And so there's a new paper that I've got coming out about how some of those same structures are reactivating during Racklin time, which relates to 1.6 accretion and collision of North Australia with present-day Yukon, which was part of Laurentia at that time. And so we see throughout the shield, only on the cratons that were in the upper plate to the Nuna collision, we see massive reactivation through multiple periods of time as a result of that, and particularly at 1.6, high angle thrusting, which is just prior to the time of the uranium mineralization. And so one of the ways that we see these reactivation events is through localization of basin-related mineralization types just below their unconformities.
Richard has a follow-up. I'd like to follow up with you on that new dating of Triassic and Jurassic dikes that you just mentioned. So I wasn't sure if he was trying to follow up here now or with you separately, but it seems maybe the latter is what he was after.
Yeah, I'll send you an email.
Sure, yeah. Sure, Richard, no problem.
All right, great, thanks. Great presentation.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, echo. Definitely. Great presentation, great discussion. I don't see anybody pushing to speak up again. So let's go ahead. Thank you very much, Sally, for the presentation. Everybody take care, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
For sure. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.